Hi, welcome to the third part of my three-part series on the Book of Mormon characters. I'm Dan Vogel, and this is how I believe Joseph Smith invented what he later called Reformed Egyptian. In previous videos, I discussed how the characters on the Whitmer document are only superficially similar to Demotic Egyptian and other ancient scripts, and that the Book of Mormon itself declares that none other people knoweth our language. I also discussed how the earliest account of Martin Harris's exchange with Professor Charles Anthon emphasized his inability to read the characters. The failure to connect these characters to any ancient language, or the Book of Mormon to any ancient people, justifies a closer look at Joseph Smith as the probable inventor of these characters. In this video, I will be discussing what I think is the probable method Joseph Smith used to create the characters on the Whitmer document. My thesis is that he invented the characters on the spot, and that while he was no doubt influenced externally by his culture, he was also inspired internally by previous invented characters. I will show that not only did Joseph Smith distort and alter the English alphabet and numbers, but he modified and revised his own invented characters, which is not what one expects of a real language. Indeed, the characters on the Whitmer document have a contrived or invented quality, which, as we have seen in a previous video, was consistent with magic tradition. There are two important points to state up front. First, I'm operating under the assumption that Joseph Smith invented the characters. This assumption, I think, is justified by the fact that the ancient hypothesis has failed. While it seems unlikely that Joseph Smith consulted books containing ancient alphabets, we do know that he spoke and wrote English and used numbers. My comparisons between the Book of Mormon characters and the alphabet and numbers familiar to Joseph Smith are therefore relevant. Also relevant is Joseph Smith's exposure to magic circles and characters. Second, I cannot say how exactly Joseph Smith invented these characters. I cannot read his mind. All I can do is test the theory against the facsimile of characters and make as compelling a case as I can. What follows is an imaginative reconstruction, to be sure, and you may or may not be convinced, but you will definitely see new and interesting relationships among the characters, and perhaps this strange document won't look so strange and chaotic anymore. The best way to demonstrate how I believe Smith created these characters on the Whitmer document is to perform a step-by-step reconstruction with commentary. Look at this first character. It shows up many times in this document, with and without the crossbar. As will become apparent, Joseph Smith had a habit of doubling his characters, sometimes disguising that doubling aspect. Note that this first character and its repetitions resemble either a large close quote or a double close parenthesis. With the bar added, it also resembles a deformed or disguised H, which, strangely enough, happens to be more clearly represented in the next character. Now look at the third character. Is this not a modified version of the H character? It looks like a 4 with a tick on the protruding crossbar. Look how easy it is to exchange parts. I prepared this animation to show the relationship between these characters. Is it coincidence that the first two characters are versions of the same letter, and that the third letter is derivative or a modification of the second? I ask, is this how a real language behaves? The fourth character is possibly inspired by that prominent flourish on the H. The next character seems to have numerical implications and looks somewhat like a counting method we are all familiar with, which just happens to be the fifth character. The next two characters are either identical or very similar to one another. Here is another example of Smith's doubling his characters. The eighth character is a 4, and the ninth, a 9. An interesting math sequence presents itself. The next character looks like a 6, which is an upside-down 9, with a small tick at the top. The character that follows is nearly the same shape. Remember, Smith likes pairs, but the tick has been moved to make it look like a T. Now follows a carrot-shaped character with a dot, which makes it look like an A. This character appears repeatedly with and without the dot. Then we have another T, or cross, which is followed by an upside-down version. Smith evidently liked this pair, together with the previous carrot-shaped character, because he repeated them often. Next, we have another repeated character, similar to the first character in the line, but without a crossbar. The next character is a reverse of the two previous characters, but also looks suspiciously like the second C in characters. Then there is the 8-shaped character, which, if the double character is counted as 1, happens to be the 8th character from the 5 plus 4 equals 9 sequence. Then a dash and a 1, which again equals 9. This is followed by a new character that looks like an intertwined 8 and 4, but also looks like a modified version of the previous 8-1 combination. Here is another way to look at it. Again, I ask, what language behaves this way? Then a character that looks sort of like a T, and a U, and a Z in 19th century longhand, and then one that looks like an M, or an upside-down W, or sideways 3, or E. Can't decide? The next character might help. A 3, twice underlined. And finally, to complete this line, an O and a parenthesis. Note that in this first line of 25 characters, 14 are pairs of repetition or disguised repetition. This is consistent with someone groping for characters and trying to fill space. However, excluding the two pairs, there are no repeated characters. Regardless of how they were invented, Joseph Smith put most of his creativity into this first line. As we will see, he will produce 26 characters before repeating begins, and then his dependence on repetition increases with each line. The second line begins with this unique character, followed by another composed of 9 short vertical strokes underlined, perhaps representing the number 10, using the same principle previously used to make 5. This is followed by 7, which is similar to the first character. Here we have another caret without a dot, but in the same sequence as before. This is followed by a solid square, which some Mormon commentators have seen as a terminal or period. If so, it would be appropriate to start the next verse with a 2, would it not? At this point, we have a repetition of the first 2 characters. However, note that on the H character, the upper left flourish has moved and looks more like a superscript 6. This pair is followed by the sideways 3 character from near the end of the first line, then the number 5 character without the dots. As we will see, the missing dots show up later. This character is an E or backwards 3 from the first line, both, coincidentally, in close proximity to the M or sideways 3 character. Not surprisingly, the next character is a 3, but instead of it being underlined, it has a tick coming out of the back. This is followed by a Z, taken from the same end of the first line. Then the double parenthesis and a period. Here we come to one of the most intriguing characters, a D, with dotted compartments, followed by repetitions of the stylized H, cross, and 2. And of course, 2 is followed by a disguised 3. Then repetitions of the longhand H and Z. Comparing line 1 and 2, note the number of repetitions. Out of 23 characters in the second line, 14 are directly influenced by the first line, which leaves 13 characters in the first line not repeated in the second, and 9 characters on the second line not repeated in the first, showing a diminished need for creativity. The third line begins with the repetition of the double parenthesis, period, and stylized D. Note here that we have our first 4-character repetition. Continuing, our next character is a V with a dot, reminding us of the A or caret character on the first line with a dot, and on the second without. Coincidentally, the next character is a T, which is a slightly disguised version of the crosses that happen to follow those A's. Now, what are the odds that a real language would behave this way? It seems clear to me that this is an example of Joseph Smith disguising his source of inspiration. Should we therefore be surprised that the next character is the A or caret-shaped character? The next character is a 3, underlined 3 times, with a curved line coming out the back, which seems inspired by the 3 underlined twice on the first line, and the 3 with a tick coming out of the back on the second. Next is a slightly different version of the 6 with a tick on the first line. It seems more than a coincidence that this 6 with a tick would follow the 3 with a tick. This next character seems like a slightly disguised version of the first character on the second line. Next, we have a disguised 4. And then what appears as a disguised version of the same character, which then becomes part of a more complex character reminiscent of the 8-1 character on the first line. Then a dot or backwards comma. Then a repetition of the L in the first line. The copyist, John or probably Christian Whitmer, accidentally repeats the L, which is called a didograph, and then wipe erases while the ink is still wet, and then writes what looks like 906. Characters, all previously used. These numbers are followed by a character we have seen before, possibly representing 10. This is followed by a repetition of the 0. Then, what looks like a not equals sign. This might be a composite of the cross and upside down cross characters. This is followed by 3 characters that have received attention by some deformed English advocates. An upside down, backwards J-O-S, as in Joseph. Notice how the O is above the line, but on the line when turned upside down. It is impossible to say that is what Joseph Smith intended, but worth mentioning nonetheless. This is followed by a 1 and another cross, and then what looks like an O-C underlined and raised above the line. Of the 25 characters in the third line, only 6 are new, so we have a diminished demand for creativity, moving from 23 in the first line to 9 in the second, and now 6 in the third. The first character in line 4 is a disguised version of the last character in the previous line, and possibly influenced by the first character on the second line. This is followed by another 1, then by what could be a disguised 5, which coincidentally is followed by what could be a representation of 5. Here are the missing 4 dots from the previous numeric symbol. Then the third appearance of the D character. This is followed by repetitions of the V with dot. Then the cross and caret pair, which ends another 4-character repetition from the previous line. This makes an interesting 7-character repetition in the second and third lines, which leads to an interesting correlation and repetition of the stylized or disguised H. This is followed by the repetition of the M5 combination, and then a blend of the backwards S and 3 characters. Then repetition of the Z and parenthesis. Then an upside-down parenthesis, which is another example of disguised doubling. In fact, The last 7 characters seem influenced by the previous sequence of characters on line 2. Oddly, this upside-down parenthesis has a line connected to it, with a 3 at the other end. This combination is strangely similar to what appears on the Hiram Smith parchment. Compare the characters that appear on the tip of one of the spokes on the magic circle, copied from Ebenezer Sibley's 1784 book, Occult Sciences. The only difference is that the characters are connected in different places. This brings up another possible parallel between the symbol at the other end of the spoke and the numeric character that appears 4 positions before the 6-3 character. I offer this as only a possible source of inspiration for Joseph Smith. This unusual character is followed by repetitions of the 2, a rough version of the longhand H, then a 1 or slash. Then, for the last character on this line, a 9. Of the 20 characters on the 4th line, 2 are new. Again, we have a diminished demand for creativity, moving from 23 in the first line to 9 in the second, to 6 in the third, and now 2. As discussed in a previous video, the last 3 lines appear to have come from a different character document, or possibly the compartments of the circle Professor Anthon said he saw. Note the space for 2 or 3 more characters at the end of the 4th line, which presumably would have been filled with the first characters of the 5th line, had it come from the same document. Note also how the next 3 lines are smaller, and the frequent occurrences of dashes, possibly indicating the various compartments of the circle. Assuming this to be the case, I make the following observation. The first set of characters is by far the longest, which seems to suggest that it may have been copied from the space between the concentric circles around the outer edge. To visualize this, let's take one of the concentric circles from the Hiram Smith parchment, and let's insert the first set of characters as I suggested. Then we'll add the other sets of characters in the middle, in the order in which they appear in the document, moving right to left. There are 16 of these. Now let's look at the characters in these 3 lines more closely. The first character on the 5th line is a disguised version of the 4-shaped character from line 3. The next 6 characters come from the first 4 lines. The next 2 characters appear to be poorly copied S's, or rather stylized lightning bolt or squarish S's, of which there are several examples in these remaining 3 lines. The next 3 characters are also repetitions. And then the repetition of the 4-shaped character from the beginning of the line. This is followed by 4 repetitions. And then what looks like a dash connected to a close parenthesis. As will become apparent, this is probably related to a character that will become more distinct as we proceed. Meanwhile, note that the dash has a wavy line over it. Then there is a new character that is similar to the 4th character in the first line. We will revisit this character in the next line. Next there is what looks like an S, then what looks like a C or open parenthesis, then a new character which looks like a scrunched 3 with a vertical line through it, then two characters that also look like 3s, and still another that looks like the 3 with an extra line at the top from the second line. That's 4 3-shaped characters in a row. Then, a compact version of the previous character on this line with similar shape. Only here, the horizontal line is shorter. We will revisit this character in the next line, where it appears in a much clearer form. Then we come to our first dash, followed by the H character in altered form. Then the OC underlined character from above, without the O. The next 3 characters are repetitions. Note that the caret-shaped character with dot also has a crossbar like an A. Note also that these 3 characters appear together on the first line. Then we come to a dash and new character that looks like a Y with a dot and curved stroke over the top. This was obviously inspired by the previous character. Then 2 characters repeated from above. Of the 33 characters on the 5th line, 5 are new. Line 6 begins with what appears to be a new character that looks like a capital B. However, it appears to be a clearer version of the scrunched 3 character with vertical line through it from the 5th line. Then we have a clearer example of the squarish S or stylized lightning bolt with a tick at the top right. Then a repetition of the number 1 and a dash. We now come to another clearer version of a previous character. The wavy line over a line with close parenthesis. This now appears to be a disguised version of the first character in this document, followed by the second character that looks like a longhand H. The less distinct version of the same characters on the previous line may suggest that some sets of characters were written in smaller compartments. Continuing, we come to a repetition of the underlined C character with a dot, and then a backwards 3 or E character, followed by what some have seen as 1/2, but it is at least a repetition of the 1 and 2 characters from previous lines. However, it may be a bad copy of another character to be discussed shortly. At any rate, this is followed by a repetition of 3, and then a dash. Then we have repetitions of the cross, A, and upside down cross. Then, the character that looks a lot like the new Y-shaped character from the previous line, only this time it looks a lot like the caret with a dot, or the V with a dot on the 4th line. And both are suspiciously close to the source of their origins. Continuing, we have another dash, and then repetitions of the solid square, what looks like a representation of 5, the caret with a dot, and Z. Another dash, and an incomplete version of the 5 character we've seen before, and then a version of the 3rd character in the document on the first line. which looks like a disguised 4. These are the only 4-shaped characters in the document that have that distinctive tick on the protruding crossbar. This link is important because the next character on the 6th line looks like a distorted version of the 4th character on the 1st. Now, is this any way for a real language to behave? Before we leave this pair of characters, note that the second appears to be a cleaner version of one of the characters on the previous line, possibly from the circumference of the circle. If this last character was not inspired by the upper left flourish on the H character in the first line, it may have come from a character on the tip of another spoke of the magic circle that appears on the Hiram-Smith parchment. It is also possible that the flourish on the H character reminded Smith of this magic character, and so he used it. Note also that among the group of magic characters on the parchment, there is a 4-shaped character with a similar tick. Continuing, we come to 2 dots, then repetitions of the 6, and open and close parenthesis. The arrangement of these 2 characters is similar to what appears on the Smith magic parchment. The dash is followed by 2 E characters, a cross, then a sideways V character from previous lines, another dash, then 2 S's or lightning bolts, and finally a new character that looks sort of like a W. Of the 31 characters on line 6, maybe 5 are new. Line 7 begins with a nearly sequential repetition of 3 characters on the previous line. Some advocates of the ancient hypothesis like to point out that if the solid square represents a terminal, then the document is to be read from right to left like Hebrew. Of course, that's assuming we are looking at a line-for-line transcription from the plates, maintained both by Joseph Smith and Christian or John Whitmer. Interestingly, a similar square character appears on another spoke of the circle on the Hiram-Smith parchment. This is followed by a dash, then upside-down cross, and a new character that looks like the sign for infinity. Then the 4 character without a tick on the protruding crossbar. Another dash, then repetitions of the underlined C, cross, and upside-down cross. Note the repetition of all 3 on line 5. Then we have a double 6, followed by what looks like the double close parenthesis and C combination from lines 1 and 5. Then the possible attempt to repeat the 3 threes from line 5. Again, notice the similarity between the first 3 and the last character on the Smith parchment. Then 3 S's or lightning bolts, a dash, then a caret. The next character could be a modified version of the not equals sign from line 3, or a poor copy of the scrunched 3 character from line 5. This is followed by 2 E characters from previous lines. Note the near identical repetition of the 2 E's in the previous line, which possibly might be related to that 1/2 character that appears at the beginning of the same line. What appears as 1/2 may be an incomplete E. Note also that the more angular E appears at the beginning of the characters on the Smith parchment. Continuing, we have a dash, then backwards S. Then what appears to be a modified version of the underlined C character. Then repetitions of the cross upside down cross combination. Note, in connection with the previous modification of the underlined C character, that these three characters appear together previously in the same line in unmodified form, as well as on the fifth line. This is a strange way for a language to behave. More likely, it points to internal creativity or contrivance. Continuing, the cross upside down cross combination is followed by a double parenthesis with crossbar. Note that these three characters appear together on the first line, without the crossbar. Then we have a dash, followed by a double S. Then we come to a new character that is very different than anything we have encountered previously. Then repetitions of the two H's from the beginning of the document, backwards S, and cross upside down cross combination, a dash, then another unusual character, which might be a poor copy of the M character from line 2. Followed by repetitions of the infinity and 4 characters, a close parenthesis with dot, and finally the cross and caret combination. Of the 43 characters in line 7, 5 are new. When he was questioned by Theodore Turley in 1838 about his apostasy from Mormonism, Book of Mormon witness John Whitmer stood by his testimony of seeing the plates by a supernatural power and handling them, but he said he could not verify the Book of Mormon came from the plates since he could not translate the original language. 175 years later, we are still unable to decipher these characters, or at least confidently link them to any ancient language. Rather than providing evidence for Joseph Smith's claim to have in his possession an ancient record engraved on gold plates, examination of these characters raises serious doubts and points to invention and contrivance. In focusing on areas of repetition, we have seen what appears to be intentional alteration of characters to disguise repetition and create artificial variety. We have also seen how the vast majority of the characters have affinity with English, numbers, and magic. It seems clear to me that what we have in this document is what Fred Gettings described in his magisterial Dictionary of Occult, Hermetic, and Alchemical Sigils as personal and fanciful characters or doodles.